You are the Empress of all Russia, but tonight, none of your titles can save your son. It is 1907. The palace is silent, too silent, until you hear the scream. Racing through the candlelit corridor, your silk gown catching on the edge of a tapestry, you burst into the nursery, and there he is. Your little boy, your only son, your heir, is curled on the floor, pale as porcelain. Blood has soaked through the linen of his trousers. It's a small fall, just a stumble from his toy carriage. But his screams won't stop. His veins don't close. His blood refuses to obey. You drop to your knees, call the doctors, pray to saints, whisper his name until your lips go numb. No one comes fast enough. You have all the power in the empire, but you cannot stop the bleeding of your own blood. And you know why. Because in your veins, in his veins, in the veins of your grandmother, there is a silent curse, passed down in royal cradles, hidden behind royal portraits, denied at royal councils, but it is real. And now your son may die, not from enemies, not from war, but from a secret you married into and chose not to stop. What you've just witnessed isn't a forgotten drama. It's a true story, one that shaped the fate of empires, silenced generations of women, and buried more than just children. This is the story of a genetic curse that bled through the most powerful families in Europe, a condition whispered behind velvet curtains, denied in public, and hidden in the gilded nursery rooms of kings and queens. It is the story of hemophilia, and how love, power, and silence made it unstoppable. Welcome to Echoes of the Past, where we uncover the overlooked and the unspeakable. If this kind of hidden history speaks to you, subscribe, like, or simply stay with us. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? Because the tale you're about to hear isn't just about bloodlines. It's about what happens when pride becomes policy, when royalty becomes a prison, and when no one, not even a queen, dares to say, enough. To understand how one royal child's bleeding shook an empire, you must understand how power flowed through Europe, not just through borders and treaties, but through veins. In the 19th century, Europe wasn't just a continent of nations. It was a web of dynasties. Crowns didn't conquer, they married. And at the center of that glittering web stood one woman, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She was called the Grandmother of Europe. Her 9 children married into nearly every major royal house: Germany, Russia, Spain, Prussia, and beyond. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly every royal heir in Europe had Victoria's blood in their veins. But Victoria carried more than titles. She carried a mutation. Hemophilia B, an inherited bleeding disorder passed through the X chromosome. Women can be silent carriers. Sons, however, are not so lucky. Victoria herself had no symptoms, but her son Leopold did. He bruised easily, bled longer after injuries, and died young. Still, no warning was given to her daughters. No tests, no explanations. Their destinies were political, not medical. And so they married, and unknowingly passed the curse on. At first, it was whispered. Then, it became clear. Princess Alice, Victoria's daughter, gave birth to a son, Friedrich, who died at just 2 years old after a fall. His bleeding wouldn't stop. Then Alex, Alice's daughter, married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, becoming Empress Alexandra. Her son, Alexei, was born a carrier's nightmare, a hemophiliac heir to the Russian throne. This wasn't just a family matter. This was a state crisis. In monarchies, heirs weren't just children. They were continuity. power, legitimacy. And now, thrones were being handed to boys who could die from a bruise. But instead of sounding alarm bells, courts tightened the curtains. Illness was a scandal, weakness a threat. Empresses were blamed, carriers were shamed, doctors were silenced or dismissed. So the children suffered in silence. Hemophilia is a cruel disease. A simple bump could cause internal hemorrhage. Knees and elbows would swell grotesquely. Blood pooled in joints. Pain came in waves, and there was no cure. These weren't private tragedies. They were seen in slow motion across Europe. In Spain, Prince Alfonso bled to death after a minor car accident. In Prussia, boys were forbidden from riding horses or climbing stairs. In Russia, the air was confined, isolated, prayed over until Rasputin arrived. Yet with each case, the same pattern followed: silence, shame, and denial. Why? Because to break the silence was to admit the truth, that the royal obsession with bloodline purity had become its own poison. Marrying cousins wasn't taboo, it was tradition. It preserved power, property, and prestige, but it also magnified genetic risk. And by the late 1800s, the royal gene pool had become an echo chamber. What's worse, everyone knew. Courtiers, doctors, priests, even rival monarchs, they all knew these children weren't well. But none dared to speak up, because speaking meant scandal, and scandal meant collapse. So the system protected itself with silence, and the bleeding continued. Segment 1, Victoria's Secret. It begins, as many royal stories do, with a birth and a silence. In 1853, Queen Victoria gave birth to her 8th child, Prince Leopold. From the start, he was different. He bruised too easily. A teething gum bled for hours. A fall down a short flight of stairs left him in bed for days. Doctors whispered among themselves. Some blamed inbreeding, others divine punishment. But none could explain why such a minor injury caused such chaos inside his small body. Hemophilia didn't have a name yet, but it had a pattern, and it terrified them. Victoria, to her credit, loved Leopold deeply. She watched him closely, coddled him more than her other children. But when he bled, she shut the door. There were appearances to uphold, empires to run, and rumors to control. By the time Leopold was a young man, the disease had a name, though not a cure. Still, he lived longer than expected, into his early 30s, but a minor fall in Cannes would kill him. A rupture in his knee led to uncontrollable hemorrhage. He bled internally until he died. And that should have been the warning. But it wasn't, because Queen Victoria also had daughters, and her daughters were valuable, not just for love or companionship, but for alliance. Each marriage was a political pact, a chess move in the great European game. She never told them, not Alice, not Beatrice, not Helena, no mention of Leopold's fatal condition, no advice, no warnings, no science, just ceremony. Alice would become the first transmitter. She passed the gene to her daughters, and they passed it further. One queen's silence became a continent's inheritance. And perhaps the cruelest part? Queen Victoria's own physician, Sir James Reed, suspected the genetic danger. He even advised caution. But his suggestions were ignored. He was not royal. He was not family. And family, above all, must protect the illusion of strength. So when Leopold died, his portrait was hung with pride in the palace. And the bleeding continued. Segment 2, The Bloodline Meets the Throne. Her name was Alix of Hesse, but Russia would know her as Alexandra Feodorovna, the last empress of the Romanovs. When she married Nicholas II in 1894, it was not only a union of two young lovers, but a collision of destinies. One carried the burden of empire, the other carried a mutation that would haunt generations. Alex was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and like her mother, Alice before her, she was a silent carrier of hemophilia. But no one spoke of it. Victoria had not warned her, and if Alex herself suspected the danger, she said nothing. Silence had become tradition. She gave birth to 4 daughters, bright, healthy, full of promise. But for Russia, they were not enough. A Tsarina was expected to bear a son, an heir. Then came 1904. At last, a boy, Alexei Nikolaevich the Tsarevich. The celebrations were thunderous. Bells rang across Moscow. Te Deums were sung. Royal proclamations declared him the hope of the dynasty. But inside the nursery, fear arrived. It started subtly. A bruise that wouldn't fade, a nosebleed that stained his sheets red. Then came the swelling, his joints inflamed, his body gripped in invisible agony. A fall from a carriage, and his leg turned black with internal blood. The doctors knew, Alex knew, Nicholas knew, but no one could say it aloud. Russia could not know that its future emperor could die from a stumble. Alex was devastated. She withdrew from court, clung to religion, and began praying obsessively. She blamed herself. She begged God for a miracle. And then she found one, or thought she had. Grigory Rasputin, a wandering mystic with oily hair, a hypnotic gaze, and a reputation for both holiness and scandal. When he laid hands on Alexei, the bleeding slowed. When he prayed, the pain seemed to lift. Desperate, Alex believed. Nicholas yielded. Rasputin became not just a healer, but a shadow ruler. His influence growing with each drop of blood, Alexei lost. Whispers filled the palace, that the Tsarina was under a spell, that the boy was cursed, that the empire was rotting from within. And outside, revolution was stirring. Yet inside the gilded rooms of the Winter Palace, Alex held her son's frail body close, whispered prayers over purple bruises, and tried to will away the disease she had unknowingly passed on. She was an empress, a mother, a descendant of Queen Victoria, and her child was bleeding. Segment 3, Rasputin and the Faith in Blood. By 1907, Russia's faith in its monarchy had already begun to erode. Famine, strikes, and failed wars had shaken the foundations. But behind palace doors, something far stranger was unraveling. The empire's survival seemed to rest on a mystic's whispered prayers. Grigory Rasputin was not a doctor. He had no formal training. He was a peasant, a preacher, and a scandal in human form. But to Empress Alexandra, he was the only one who could stop the bleeding. And she had proof. When doctors failed to ease Alexei's pain, Rasputin's letters seemed to calm him. When the boy was near death, Rasputin sent a telegram, "The pain will stop. The boy will not die." And within hours, Alexei improved. Was it coincidence, hypnosis, psychological manipulation? No one could say for certain. But Alex believed with the fervor of a drowning soul, clutching the only floating wreckage. And Rasputin knew his power. He began to dictate appointments, interfere in military decisions, demand loyalty from courtiers. His debauchery, drunken nights, alleged affairs became rumors the empire couldn't contain. The Russian people began to whisper, "The Tsarina is ruled by a mad monk. The heir is weak. The dynasty is cursed." Meanwhile, Alexei continued to suffer. In public, he smiled. In private, he screamed into his mother's arms, his joints swelling like bruised fruit, his legs too fragile to walk. He once bled from a ride in a carriage. Another time, from a bump on the hip. No battlefield, no assassin, no poison, just gravity and time were his greatest enemies. And still, no one outside the family knew. The royal court concealed his condition with manic discipline. Even foreign dignitaries were told he was delicate, overprotected, spiritual. But in truth, Alexei lived like a prisoner. His sisters adored him. Nicholas loved him. Alexandra worshipped him. But all were caught in a royal theatre where weakness could not be shown and honesty could not be spoken. And as Russia inched closer to revolution, the future of the monarchy hung not on policy or armies, but on the blood of a boy who could not stop bleeding. Segment 4. The Empire-Wide Inheritance. Russia's tragedy was not unique. It was only the most visible. Elsewhere across Europe, the same silent inheritance unfolded, generation after generation, hidden in velvet chambers, behind embroidered coats of arms, and under vows of royal pride. In Spain, the story took a devastating turn. Princess Beatrice of the United Kingdom, another daughter of Queen Victoria, carried the same genetic mutation. She married Prince Henry of Battenberg, and their daughter, Victoria Eugenie, became Queen of Spain. At her wedding to King Alfonso XIII, golden carriages rolled through the streets of Madrid. Church bells rang, cannons fired. But as she stepped into her role as queen, no one warned her of what she carried inside her blood. She bore sons, heirs to the Spanish crown, and just like their cousin Alexei, they began to bleed. Her second son, Infante Gonzalo, was especially fragile. A minor bump to the leg caused a severe hemorrhage. His life became a tightrope walk. No games, no running, constant fear. His older brother Alfonso, the Prince of Asturias, also showed symptoms. When he married against royal wishes and was stripped of his titles, it was not just a scandal of love. It was an escape from the burden of expectation and fragility. Then, in 1934, Alfonso died in a car accident. The cause? A ruptured artery from the steering wheel impact. His hemophilia turned a survivable injury into a death sentence. Queen Victoria Eugenie was devastated. She had watched her children suffer in silence, and Spain now whispered that she had cursed the royal line. Portraits of her were quietly removed from halls. Gossip magazines speculated on English blood, but the truth was genetic, and it was everywhere. In Germany, it was the same. In Prussia, in Hesse, in Mecklenburg, boys were dying young, hidden from public view. Girls were married off as diplomatic gifts, carrying the mutation across borders, wrapped in silk and ceremony. The public didn't know, but the courts did, doctors did, monarchs did, and yet no one spoke. Because to name it was to unravel everything. The illusion of divine right, the fantasy of perfect lineage, the doctrine of strength. To admit that the royal houses of Europe were collapsing from within, from a disease passed from mother to son, from cousin to cousin, was unthinkable. It would mean admitting weakness, humanity, biology. So they told themselves stories. It's not that serious. He's just fragile. God will protect us. The people must not know. And all the while, the blood kept flowing. Segment 5. The Silence That Shattered Thrones. By the time revolution came for the Romanovs, Alexei was 13, and already an old man in a child's body. He could barely walk. His legs had grown bowed from repeated internal bleeding. He was pale, exhausted, his smile brittle. The heir to the Russian Empire lived like a porcelain doll in a palace of ghosts. And then the ghosts came for real. In 1917, as World War I devoured Europe and trust in monarchy crumbled, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. The royal family was placed under house arrest, first at Tsarskoye Selo, then Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg. Rasputin was already dead, murdered by nobles in a desperate attempt to cut his influence from the empire. It was too late. For months, Alexei remained bedridden. His body ached. His blood threatened him daily. His sisters read to him. His mother prayed. And his father, once Tsar of all the Russias, stood helpless. On the night of July 16th, 1918, the family was told they would be moved again. They were led into a basement. Alexei helped down the stairs, too weak to walk. There, under the flickering light of a single bulb, they were executed. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. The assassins shot quickly, then stabbed, then bludgeoned. Alexei's body, weakened and swaddled in jewels sewn into his clothes, was hardest to kill. And just like that, the bloodline stopped, not from nature, but from rage. But the bleeding didn't end with the Romanovs. In Spain, Gonzalo would die after a car crash. In Germany, unnamed heirs vanished from public record. In England, Queen Elizabeth II's uncle, Prince John, born with epilepsy and possibly other hidden conditions, was raised in seclusion, kept from public life. Everywhere, traces of the mutation lingered, silenced, diluted, but never fully gone. And in the halls of palaces, portraits still hang, of mothers smiling, sons standing proud, weddings dressed in gold. No bruises, no bandages, no pain, just silence. Because in royal history, silence is the oldest tradition of all. He was the boy who couldn't stop bleeding. And in the end, he bled for a crown that no longer existed. When the bullets stopped in that dim cellar in Yekaterinburg, they didn't just end a family, they ended a myth. That royal blood was sacred, perfect, ordained. The truth had been exposed, through pain, through silence, and ultimately, through death. Alexei died as he had lived, slowly, helplessly, shrouded in shadows. His parents could never fully lift. And though the Romanovs were buried in secret graves, their story bled into history with agonizing clarity. But Russia was not alone. In Spain, Queen Victoria Eugenie became a symbol of whispered tragedy. Her surviving sons, too weak to reign, faded from the line of succession. The monarchy teetered, then fractured. Generations later, Spain would remember her not just as queen, but as the woman who brought the curse. Across Europe, other houses quietly edited their family trees. Photographs were cropped, names forgotten, medical records sealed. And the silence, that ancient royal tool, was deployed again. This time, not to preserve illusion, but to bury guilt. The cost was immeasurable. Not in gold, not in land, but in children. Sons who lived in fear of falling, mothers who carried guilt in their marrow, fathers who watched, unable to protect. Even science, when it finally caught up, could only offer diagnosis, never absolution. And though hemophilia became better understood, even treatable in modern times, the echoes of its royal devastation remained, not just in medical journals, but in museums, in crumbling palaces, in whispered family secrets passed down like heirlooms. Because the true legacy of Europe's royal families wasn't just power or prestige. It was what they refused to admit until it was too late. History often frames royal families as larger than life, portraits in oil, faces on coins, names in textbooks. But behind the crowns were human bodies, and inside those bodies, fragile blood, unforgiving, uncontrollable, and undeniable. The story of hemophilia in European royalty is not just a medical case study. It's a parable of pride, silence, and the cost of appearances. It forces us to ask, what happens when the need to appear strong becomes more important than actually being well? What happens when a mother knows her son might suffer, but says nothing because her duty is to dynasty? What happens when a child is born with a condition no one wants to name, because naming it might unravel the whole house? These aren't just questions for queens and czars. They're questions for all of us. How many families today still bury medical truths out of shame? How many systems, be they governments, corporations, even cultures, choose silence over transparency, lineage over honesty, appearance over healing? And how often do the most vulnerable pay the price for everyone else's need to look intact? In the end, the royal families did not fall because of one illness. They fell because they could not speak about it. And perhaps the most enduring wound is not the bleeding, but the silence that allowed it to continue for so long. Some legacies are written in stone, others in blood. But the ones we never speak of, the ones buried beneath silence, are often the ones that shape us the most. In the end, what remains of those royal children are faded portraits, blood-stained diaries, and the haunting realization that their suffering was never truly theirs alone. It belonged to an entire system, built on tradition, protected by silence, and afraid of truth. If you've never heard this story before, you're not alone. And if you have, tell us, which part stayed with you? Which silence felt the loudest? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, consider joining us. There are more echoes from the past waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, may we speak what others were forced to swallow.